Okay, welcome back again. This is our last lecture for the first semester. So you can say basically by the end of today, you've done 1/4 of the program. And we begin always with a little prayer, and then with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for your many blessings, for the gift of life, for having us here today once again, delving into these bioethical issues and trying to establish a theological anthropology, a view of the human person that is dignified, that is according to your divine will, as you tell us, you teach us that we have been created in your image and likeness. At the same time, we want to be honest, Lord, with the evidence, with the scientific evidence of the fossil record. And so this particular lecture, I ask for your inspiration as we seek to integrate the scientific data with our beliefs, our religious beliefs, that we may see a compatibility and a complementarity toward a rich vision of who we are and what is our purpose here on this earth and in life eternal. As always, we ask, Lord, for those who are in most need of your divine mercy. In the name of Christ, our Lord.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, so here we go. Want to pick up a little bit on the last lecture, which was basically an introduction to sacred scripture from the Catholic perspective. In other words, the 73 books that we consider canonical, meaning that library, that little biblioteca, is closed now. Those are the books that have been recognized officially, at least within the Catholic Church, and are considered to be inspired, which will be that second author, right, the divine author, in addition to all the human authors that the books of the Bible have. Then we know it's subdivided, of course, into the Old Testament and New Testament. Sometimes you also see the reference, the Ancient Covenant and the New Covenant in the blood of the Lamb, if you look at it from a Christological perspective, which, by the way, we as Catholics pick up a lot of the tradition of what is known as the Fathers of the Church, right, the patristics, which are the writers of the first centuries, kind of the first millennium, more or less, if we stretch it out a little bit, the first 1,000 years, theologians that were writing, mostly men, but there are a few women who also wrote theology back then. And they're called now, we have to call them the fathers and mothers of the church. At any rate, the standard that these theologians used early on was to interpret the Old Testament in a Christological perspective, what we call a Christological perspective. In other words, what is the key of interpretation of the Old Testament is in the New Testament. In fact, there are sayings, what is hidden in the Old is revealed in the New, in the person of Jesus Christ, because one way or another, the Old Testament is announcing the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah, right? And so it is not just history of the Jewish people, it is salvation history, which concretizes in the person of Jesus Christ. So whenever there is a doubt about a passage, a particular passage in the Old Testament, and if you have read the Old Testament or parts of it, or heard it proclaimed, for example, at Mass and so forth, typically the first reading on Sundays, some of those passages can be very challenging. And so they have to be interpreted to be able to make sense out of them, to go to that deeper meaning, the sensus plenior, look at it from a Christological perspective. In other words, from the benefit that we have of the event of Jesus Christ, his incarnation, his life here on earth, his passion, death, and resurrection, okay? And that hopefully will help interpret some of those passages that can be cryptic or challenging. For example, the people of Israel asking God to wipe out their enemies, or the people of Israel being punished by God for not wiping out their enemies and leaving some alive. So those are passages that have to be put very much in the context of the time. All right, so I want to move forward today and go a little deeper into Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and also, but doing a parallel with the scientific evidence that we have of the origin of the universe, the origin of Earth, the origin of life, and more specifically, the origin of human life. Okay, so those four origins lined up first with chapter 1 of Genesis, and then moving into 2 and 3. Okay, so there are no questions for comment. I don't have an outline, by the way. I didn't have time to do it, unfortunately, but I'll send you the PowerPoint as always. And by the way, there's no summary. Did I say it already? There's no summary for this lecture. Okay, so people have a break, and so do I, because I have to hand in grades by Monday. So it'll just be the average of what you have until now. So no summary for this lecture, but you will have the video and the PowerPoint and the materials. All right, moving forward then, I'm just calling this the integration between science and faith, looking at the biological anthropology, in other words, the scientific evidence for the origin of man ultimately, what we're calling phylogenetics, the beginning of the human species, and then sacred scripture. Make this bigger, get the tile out of the way somewhere. Okay. Okay, so we need to go back a little bit in time to maybe 1,000 years, 1 to 2,000 years before the time of Christ. So 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, what was the common belief of Earth and the universe at the time? And the general belief was, first of all, I want to preface this by saying that this is all pre-scientific, okay? Pre-scientific mentality or knowledge or interpretation of man and the earth that surrounds man. It's pre-scientific in the sense that it's certainly way before our modern understanding of science and the scientific method of observation and experimentation and so forth. We can say that modern science really begins very recently, only about 500 years ago in Europe with the Copernican revolution and Galileo and the whole controversy between the universe being, or the solar system actually being, geocentric or heliocentric. We talked a little bit about that a while back, all right? So these communities and these cultures and civilizations, even though they were great in their own time, and many of them built significant structures that are still there today in ruins, all right? Like the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Babylonians, the Romans, the Greeks, China, the Chinese dynasties, even India. It is said that the Chinese wall can be seen from space. All right, it is so large and massive, and it's only little segments that are left of it. Okay, so it's just a massive structure that can actually be seen. I think it's the only structure, human structure, that can be seen from space, from outer space. I don't know if the pyramids are actually seen from outer space or not, the Egyptian pyramids from satellites. Anyway, all this to say that as impressive as those civilizations were and advanced for their own time, even in mathematics and engineering and other, the cultures, the arts and so forth, scientifically it was not really science as we know it today, the modern concept of science. Yet that they did have some kind of intuition of the world, the universe, and the standard in the various different civilizations is that the world was flat. Okay, so this whole idea of the flat Earth society, they were it. Simply because by standing around and looking around, it seemed fairly flat, right? The circumference of the Earth is so large that it seems to the plain sight flat. But they did have a circular notion, so it's a flat disk, which is interesting. So they had a notion that somehow it was a circular, that the perimeter, the edge was circular. And then there were these domes, right? And there was an inner dome, and there was an outer dome, and there was some kind of a wall there, a ceiling, right? A roof. And that's what's indicated here. This is the cosmology of the time, which is obviously pre-scientific. It doesn't match today's observations, but there is some evidence of that. For example, in this stone tablet that goes back to the Babylonian Empire, about 5 centuries before Christ, CBC, centuries before Christ. And it depicts these 7 islands. So here are 5 of them, right, in these points. And the other 2 are actually, the inner circle is split in half. So on the right here, it's called Haban, and then this other one, Urartu. And it's divided by a river. And this river is the Euphrates River, which today, I'll talk a little bit about it further down. The Tigris and the Euphrates, the confluence between those 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which are very ancient, is known as the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. And that's where we have today Iran, Iraq, and all these areas of high conflict. But these are civilizations that go back millennia, not just centuries, but millennia. So here is some actual geological evidence of a conception of the world at the time, which is basically a flat disk. And then the center, this little hole, is the epicenter of it all. And of course, Babylon the Great was at the center of the known world back then. Right? Every civilization put its own structures at the center, because that's where they were standing. Okay, so just this basic 3 layers, right? The Earth, which is a flat disk, and then these domes that involve water, and this primitive water that is around. It could be fresh water, it could be salt water. And then under the disk was the Sheol, which is the abode of the dead. Not necessarily hell as our conception of hell today as a place of damnation, but just a place of the dead, okay, which was, as can be seen here, a dark place. And then, depending on the different cultures, through that hole, which some Native Americans, for example, call it the Sipapu, there is a connection with the underworld back and forth, and spirits at certain times of the year, under certain ceremonies, can come up and down through that hole. All right, so it's a sacred hole for them. So it's interesting that there was some belief in the afterlife that had to do with this underworld and the dead, and that there was some degree of communication through that hole, which, like I say, in the Native Americans, it's called the Sipapu. And there are references of that in other native cultures in Central and South America, and also in the ancient Middle East. All right, for Israel itself, there were 2 basic models of creation, okay, because Israel is going to integrate their observations with their theology or religiosity. Remember, Israel is a theocracy. In other words, it's a religious state, even to this day. The Knesset, which is their name for the parliament, is basically run by the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews. Okay, so they have religious power and effective civil power. Excuse me for a moment. An issue? Sorry. No, it's controversial, but there's an integration between soul and God. Sorry. Okay, so basically these 2 models, the Logos and the Agon. All right, the Logos is a speech, which actually is it's a Greek word, which means word or speech. God speaks and shapes nature, which is or matter, which is unresisting, is just amorphous matter. All right. And so really in this speech, what happens is God is forming matter. And I have to pick up a little bit of philosophy that we did at the beginning, making the distinction between shape and form. The distinction between shape and form. If you recall that, yes, we had a little dictum, form follows function. Remember form follows function? Okay. The shape of the structure of the thing is according to the function of the thing, or the shape of the structure in nature, in animals and plants and others. But really, that form is talking about shape in the anatomical sense or the physiological sense. Form is a deeper concept, all right? And for example, we say that there is a substantial unity between matter and form, so that we don't have unformed matter. For example, just those little pastelitos that I'm looking at deliciously there, okay? Yes, it's amazing what the sight and the smell can do to the mind. So we can analyze that biochemically, and we know that it will be, we're going to find what there? Well, mostly the carbohydrates, right? The forbidden fruit, the carbohydrates. So there'll be starch, there'll be glucose, there's jam and so forth, there's guava. But all those chemicals are coming together to form a particular shape. And so it has the shape of pastelito, but it's actually, it's a type, all right, of pastelico, and there are guava pastelitos, there are pineapple pastelitos, and there are meat pastelitos. So that's, the form is the whole thing, substantially what it is, as opposed to, let's say, a coconut, or even just the guava fruit before it's been processed, or the pineapple fruit. The pineapple fruit and the pineapple pastelito both have pineapple, but they're different forms, right? This one is the actual fruit, and the other one is the processed pastry. Okay, so that speech, that logos, has to do with forming, with giving substance to matter. So you see the philosophy behind this, all right? The structure, the philosophical structure, which is implied in their theology. It is God because God is omniscient. He knows, and he knows the substance. In fact, he creates substance. That's why he's God, all right? Okay. And so also it's a reference to the tetragrammaton, remember? The Yahweh, which comes up in chapter 2 of Genesis, the tetragrammaton. All right, and also there is water involved here. These waters are these primordial waters that are, it's not, I'll talk a little bit about univocal. Words are not univocal. These waters are not interpreted in our biochemical way of interpreting water as H2O, with or without minerals dissolved in it. And the other way of, the other model of looking at creation is this agon struggle. God does battle with these monsters of the sea. So there's a reference to the water again, the primordial waters. And this is at the beginning of the world, and then establishes, this is to establish the sovereignty of God. So the other aspect is omnipotent, right? So roughly in the big picture, you can say that the first model is a reference to the wisdom of God, the omniscience. And the second model is another characteristic, if you will, of God, or another potency of God, is that he is all-powerful, omnipotent, and is able to then said, to conquer, all right, to win over the monsters of the deep, which are mythological monsters. Moving forward then, and let me speak a little bit more about words that are not univocal. Words that are not univocal means that they have several different meaning, okay? And it's not just like bear, for example, in English. Depends on first how you spell it, but also even with the same spelling. So there is bear, B-E-A-R, and then there is bear, B-A-R-E, right? To bear and to bear, all right? And they have different meanings, certainly. But even bear, B-E-A-R, also has different meaning, right? Because one is what? One is the ursus, the animal, the bear animal, okay? Whether it's a panda or a black or whatever bear or a grizzly. But then the other bear is to tolerate, to bear is the verb. And so they're pronounced the same, they're written the same, but they have different meaning. What's the meaning? Well, the meaning is in context, all right? And those are words that are not univocal. The same with time, okay? Time, for example, we have a single word for time, but there are different types of time. There is chronological time, and then there is a special time, where chronological time warps, all right? So for example, if we are waiting for our computer to turn on, it takes forever, okay? Even though realistically, it may just be a few seconds, not even a minute, but it's taking forever. And that forever really is an eternity. Whereas if we are at a very fun party or whatever event or an exciting movie, it went by very fast, even though we have actually experienced that for several hours, but it was very fast. Time goes fast when we're having fun, right? So you see two different perspectives of time. The Greeks actually had two different words for it, which is very useful because they had chronos, and that's where we get the chronometer and chronology and so forth, which is the measured time of even intervals. But then there is kairos, and kairos is that special time, either of festive or sadness or whatever, or drama. And I suspect that there may be a theater influence to this because the theater does that, right? Can project and engage the audience in some special time, either of festivity or grieving and so forth. And we know that Greek classical theater, well, it's one of the foundations of Western civilization. That is an issue with, or that is similar to what is happening to the word day specifically, because if you think about fundamentalism, okay, where do some people get stuck in the Bible with regards to the scientific evidence of the billions of years that have passed chronologically since the Big Bang to the current universe? Well, one stickiness is these 6 days of creation, right? And we don't want to discard God and say, well, it turns out to be all a magician. It's fantasy anyway. It's like Santa Claus for kids and the weak. But since we are strong in the scientific evidence of these long periods of time, then if we stick to a literal interpretation of day, we have to ditch it out because it doesn't match the scientific evidence that is clearly in front of us. So what I'm saying is that this day is an example of a word that is not univocal. It has at least these two layers of interpretation. One that is actually a 24-hour thing, passing of time, but the other one is that simply is a reference to a period of time, all right, that is not tied in with chronology or with 24 hours. So there it is, the first day. It's the passage where the word comes up, Yom, in Hebrew. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly or not, but at least that's where it appears. Again, remember that ancient Hebrew only had vowels, only had consonants. Okay, vowels were added later just for the sake of being able to pronounce it and other people to understand it. Let me go back to that URL then, to the Bible Hub, to use the actual reference from this interlinear, the Hebrew interlinear. You're familiar with this one already. Okay. So here is Bereshit in the beginning, as the Bible begins, and so forth. What God did on the first day. The light, separating light for darkness. I'm looking for the first day. Okay, whoops. All right, and remember that is written from right to left. So it's a little awkward to read this, but it's there nonetheless. Okay, moving forward then. So what I have here is, oh, and by the way, we're going to be moving between the deterministic and the probabilistic realms also, all right? Remember, again, just to give you a brief example, which of these two diagrams, figures, is deterministic, and which one is probabilistic? Well, this is a physical piece that is in a museum, actually exists physically, so this is deterministic. It actually exists. It's a determined piece of archaeology, all right? It's an artifact that has been dated and so forth. What is probabilistic is its date, for example, and also this conception is probabilistic of what the people of the time thought, okay? So we're going to be doing that back and forth. All right, so here is the most accepted probabilistic model of the universe, the origin of the universe, and the 13.7 billion years that have elapsed. Is this Chronos or Kairos? This 13.7. Chronos. It's Chronos. But is it deterministic or probabilistic? Probabilistic, right? Because we weren't there for sure. So this is a model. We are assuming that from the best evidence that we can gather, that astrophysicists, mathematicians, and statisticians can gather, this is the projection they give us. What could be, if there's anything deterministic about this model, what could it be? Actually, two things. Right here at the edge of the cone, because this represents what? The present. As we look out, we see this with some help, right? The help is going to be the satellites, the telescopes, the satellite telescopes like the Hubble and so forth, which, by the way, is what scientific evidence we had for that expansion, seeing the galaxies that are separating from each other, all right, over time. So if anything is deterministic, it would be at the edge of this, the current time. But I said two things also. You see this light blue over here, checkered pattern. This is what is known as the background radiation, which can also be detected today. All right, this background radiation can be detected today, but is estimated, is projected back to the origin at the end of inflation. So remember the two moments here, the two big moments, inflation and then expansion, right? And inflation and the two time scales, the two chronos here are drastically at opposite ends. What is the time frame for inflation? Let me give you a second as a reference. It's nanoseconds, it's 10 to the minus 20, 10 to the minus 30 seconds, right? So inflation is incredibly fast within fractions of a second. All right, happens in inflation, and that's why precisely this burst. Now, when you put it in the context of the time frame of the chronology of how that original event happened, that singularity, explosion of light, within nanoseconds, was that inflation, and then the expansion since then. Look at the scale in the billions of years, incredibly slow, opposite end of the chronology. It's something that people sometimes they miss that, and that's why this is represented as an explosion, because to the naked eye, I think the naked eye, what is the minimum time frame that we can detect? When they do the subliminal imaging, right? That is controversial. I think it's 1/16 of a second or so that it takes for the eye, the brain to record, to actually record the time lapse. I think it's 1/16 of a second. So that's really very slow compared to the inflation moment. All right. Okay. All right. Look at the narrative, having that as a scientific background to the best model that scientists can give us today, which remember is a model, so it's probabilistic. Let's look now at the scripture narrative, a little more detail, all right, in a non-fundamentalistic way, in a non-literal way, okay, looking for the deeper meaning of that passage. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless wasteland. See? No form, and I'm glad he mentions it wasn't shapeless, it was formless. There's a difference between those two words, because God is substantially forming the universe, giving it its own nature, its own substance, and that's why he is the creator. He is that omniscient being. Darkness covered the abyss, while a mighty wind swept over the waters. So there's a reference to the primordial waters. Where did that abyss and those waters come from if God is creating? Okay, so we have to keep it in context that this is not chronos, this is kairos. Then God said, there's a logos, let there be light. Here's the omnipotence, right? He says, and so it happens. In God, there's another passage from Scripture, I think it's from Prophet Isaiah. It says, God's word is not without effect. If God says it's going to happen. When we say it, sometimes it happens. Most of the time it doesn't happen. I mean, who obeys it sometimes? All right? We have difficulty obeying ourselves, our conscience and our mind and our will and our desires. But for God, is instantaneous. He says it, he wants it, he desires it, boom, it's done. What's next? What do you want next? Okay? God saw how good the light was. Then God separated the light from the darkness. Again, kairos, there's not a chronological distance there. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Thus, evening came and morning followed the first day. So again, if we do not interpret day literally as a 24-hour period, and we look for the deeper meaning of this passage, this whole lecture is speculative, okay? And this is Father Chaffee's opinion. But in my opinion, that matches a lot with the best model that science can give us about the origin of the universe today. And that's why it's been called the Big Bang, or the moment of singularity scientifically. And it's interesting that it was actually a priest, astrophysicist who proposed it, right? Dr. Lemaitre, a Belgian astrophysicist and Jesuit priest. All right, so let's go to the second day. Now look at this. Then God said, let there be a dome in the middle of the waters to separate one body of water from the other. And so it happened, all right? So that's why this cosmology is based on this ancient myth, which was not exclusive to the people of Israel, by the way. They're picking up, their culture is not immune to the surrounding cultures, all right? And so they're picking up what is the common belief of all these other cultures around them, and cultures that preceded them, sometimes by several hundred years or even millennia, like the Egyptians and the Hindu and other Chinese dynasties. So God made the dome, and it separated the waters above the dome from the waters below it. Bless you. There was a need to have some kind of a mythological explanation for what? Which was simple. Again, simple. We have to kind of try to see through the eyes of a child as the child goes out into a field one day and looks around. All of a sudden, she or he sees a flat field, all right? Maybe there's some mountains on one side, maybe there's water, a lake, or the ocean on the other side, but it looks basically flat and kind of round as she rotates, and looks up, and there's, well, it looks kind of like a dome. In fact, the sun is describing that dome, that circumference. But then there is another phenomenon aside from the water that I'm seeing here horizontally next to me, either a lake, a river, or the ocean, all right, I'm also seeing another type of water that's doing what? It's coming down from heaven. It's called rain, and it's a natural phenomenon. It kept the whole civilization alive with agriculture and all that, so they really depended on this rain. The rain was very precious to them, and in the Middle East even more so because it's a semi-desertic environment, and that's precisely why the Fertile Crescent is so important, because it was more wet and moist there. But rain, and there's these clouds, there are these white masses that are floating around, and then sometimes they come down and precipitate. So there's this mysterious water coming from the dome above, right? And so they have to establish, God has to establish the separation between the waters above and the waters below. And so he does that. The dome above, calls the sky, it's just a word for sky in Hebrew. And then we have the second day. Second day is the separation of the waters, basically, which are these primordial waters. If we look at after inflation, we have this expansion. Well, again, if we look at further detail of that cosmological model, all right, in further detail, the astrophysicists are telling us that there is this gradual condensation into galaxies. Well, remember, first the elements have to be formed. The elements start condensing and forming other elements through the different combinations of protons, neutrons, and electrons, the fundamental particles. But this gradual but definite and massive condensation, coagulation of matter into what we call galaxies today, all right? And these galaxies, by and large, tend to be a disk shape, and that disk is not, and it's kind of flat, but it's also rotating. So it has a dynamic motion of an internal rotation, but also a translation around the universe, all right, and in relation to other galaxies. And as we look deeper into the galaxies and further along that process, that chronological process of condensation, eventually we get two different types of bodies that are forming, okay? This would be in a mature galaxy, say. What do we have? We see essentially what we call solar systems, where typically there would be luminous bodies and opaque bodies, right? And the luminous body tends to be the larger one, massive, but we know today gaseous, of the three states of matter, gaseous, whereas the opaque bodies tend to be liquid and or solid, all right, as there's a gradual cooling effect here, definite cooling effect, all right? But then there's also this rotation and translation, where all of these bodies are turning or spinning on their own axis, and also revolving around the largest body, which is going to be the one that is exercising most gravity. Okay, so we see again the four fundamental forces at play here at the super macroscopic level, the strong force and the weak force maintaining the atoms together. At the super macroscopic level, electromagnetism and gravity, which are also considered fields. All right, so there's a general match if we consider the waters some kind of a fluid, which for our understanding today could be both are fluids, gas and liquids are fluids, okay? So it's a potential, the sequencing matches anyway, it matches. Let's move on to the, all right, recalling again the Agon model of creation. Remember, that's the one that is the struggle that establishes God's omnipotence. And again, Genesis 1. So there's a lot of confluence of backgrounds here. The theological background of Genesis 1, I remember, comes from which tradition? Of the four traditions? the priestly tradition, which remember is formal, is rigorous, is also authoritative, because they were of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Levi, were the priestly tribe, and they were involved in the ritual sacrifices in the temple. They have real effective authority, even political, civil authority over the people, okay? And so God's omnipotence, the authority of God, is going to be highlighted in that Genesis 1 passage. All right, so God is this divine warrior, and there is this mythological battle with 4 creatures, creatures of the deep, which generally would live in those waters, in the primordial waters, including the sea, Death, Tannin, and Leviathan. Leviathan, at least, has been represented as a whale or a huge fish in the Old Testament. Okay. Now, interesting that the world of nature joins in the battle. Okay, allies with God, like an assistant, helping God in this battle. And so God is enthroned on this divine mountain, this throne, and then he speaks, picking up from the Logos tradition, and nature brings forth the created world. So nature is at the service of God. Nature is at the service of God. All right, continuing on to the third day, God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into a single basin. Again, these waters have to be tamed, right? Because these primordial waters come out from the deep and from the chaos, they have to be tamed. So into the basin. Again, in a pre-scientific world, they didn't really have notion that the gravity of Earth is maintaining liquid water in its place. And so gather into a basin so that the dry land may appear. And so it happened, the water under the sky was gathered into its basin and the dry land appeared. By definition, when you separate water, land is going to appear, okay, on the dry part. So God called the dry part earth, and the basin of the water he called the sea. God saw how good it was. Then God said, there are 2 moments here of creation on the third day. Let the earth bring forth vegetation. Again, nature is assisting God, right, in creation. So now we're going to get into living nature here. Living nature come forth. First, there had to be that further ordering between water and water as we know it today, and land. And now vegetation is going to come forward. Living things. Every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree that bears fruit in its seed with the seed in it. And so it happened that earth brought forth every kind of plant that bears seed and every kind of fruit tree on the earth that bears fruit with its seed in it. God saw how good it was. Evening came and morning followed the third day. In other words, a third period that is distinct from the previous 2. When we match up what scientific evidence we have, of course, remember accretion, which is the consolidation of the opaque bodies, included planet Earth, but then the emergence of photosynthesis. You notice that biblically, in a pre-scientific mindset, plants come before animals. So the sequence, the chronology in the big picture matches, okay? What we're doing injustice is to go into the details, because here it's mentioning fruit trees and seeds and so forth. We know today that fruit trees are angiosperms. They're the most modern plants, if you will, the more complex and the more evolved. But way before that, we had to have photosynthesis. And photosynthesis began with the cyanobacteria. Remember cyanobacteria? Okay. And which they have photosynthetic pigments. And these are the cyanobacteria bloom that happen periodically when conditions are ripe and it becomes ideal. Remember, under ideal conditions, bacteria duplicate every 20 minutes approximately, okay? So you have 3 generations within an hour. If you do a geometric progression of that, You know, within a few hours, you have thousands, and then a few more hours, you have millions, and within a day, you have billions and trillions of bacteria, because at every 20 minutes, the population is doubling, right? It's called a geometric progression. All right, so periodically, these algae, they're known as algae bloom also, but they can be either algae or cyanobacteria, but I'm concentrating on the cyanobacteria at this time, which to the simple eye also look like algae. Here is a satellite picture. Okay, this is a satellite photograph of, I think it's in the Great Lakes somewhere. Not exactly sure, but you can see definitely green and blue, right? This green mass is all cyanobacteria. I mean, this is so large that cities, you can't even see cities, and this is all populated along here, okay? These little tufts of white, what do you think those are? See little tufts of white here, okay? Little floating sheep. Okay, those are clouds. Those are clouds. So the scale here is very minute, right? And these are, this is an algae bloom photograph from satellite, from space. They can be massive. My point is simply that, you know, we traced cyanobacteria, what, to about 3.8 billion years ago, out of 4.5, 4.6 billion that the Earth had. The first thing were the producers, the first living things. Matches the big picture of the third day of creation. Let's move forward. All right, let's look at the fourth day. Then God said, this is the one that really is internal evidence that day should not be interpreted literally, okay? God said, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate day from night. Let them mark the fixed times, the days and the years. Fixed times now, chronos, days and years. And serve as luminaries in the dome of the sky to shed light upon the earth. And so it happened. God willed it, and it happened. God made the two great lights, the greater one to govern the day and the lesser one to govern the night. And he made the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to shed light upon the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from darkness. God saw how good it was. All of creation has this connotation, this underpinning of being good, because God wills the good. Evening came and morning followed the fourth day. All right, so here again is a cosmology of the time from a different model, a little more simplified, but now it includes these celestial bodies, all right, within the dome, because outside of that dome is the primordial waters still, all right? You have the greater light, the sun, the lesser light, the moon, stars here on the side, and again, the clouds are around sometimes, not too often, in the Middle East. These are photographs. So again, here is a probabilistic model. Here is a deterministic model. These are actual photographs of the sun and the moon from space, which shows part of Earth, all right? And included the stars here and the moon, lesser and greater lights. Back then, there really was no distinction between luminous bodies and opaque bodies, right? Today, we would make the distinction. We know that whereas the sun is generating its own light, right? Luminous body. What about the moon? Is the moon luminous? Yes, no, not sure. Okay, the moon is not luminous. The moon is opaque. It doesn't generate its own light, all right? How about the Earth? Neither. We're also an opaque body, all right? We're not a light bulb, okay? So, but the moon looks bright at night when we look at it, and a full moon is as bright as can be. So what is that brightness coming from? It's a mirror. It's a reflection of the sun, okay? It's what little reflection we get. Most of that reflection is being absorbed by the surface of the moon. That's why the surface of the moon is, I don't know how many hundreds of degrees hot, Fahrenheit, all right? Whereas the dark side of the moon is hundreds of degrees cold, minus hundreds. I don't know exactly the numbers right now, But this side, most of that light is being transformed into heat, dissipated into Earth, and absorbed into the light side of the moon, what is called the light side. And then what little is reflected is what we see. Okay? But only the sun is, technically speaking, a luminous body. So again, we cannot hold the detail of the text, of the biblical text, to the fire, but in the sensus plenior, in the big picture, what do we see? After the first 3 days and getting to the creation of life, right, with the producers, now the sacred author takes like a step back. Once he has established how the flat earth happened, right, up to the living plants, now the sacred author kind of looks up and is going to tell us how the domes happen. Okay? And looking at the luminaries on day 4th, because to narrate it, there has to be some kind of sequence. Words have to follow each other in order to make sense out of them. All right, let's move forward. The 5th day, look what happens on the 5th day. Then God said, let the water teem with an abundance of living creatures, and on earth let birds fly beneath the dome of the sky. And so it happened. God created the great sea monsters and all kinds of swimming creatures with which the water teems, and all kinds of winged birds. God saw how good it was, and God blessed them, saying, be fertile, multiply, and fill the water of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. Evening came and morning followed, the 5th day. So what do we see? Don't we see 2 different kinds of creation here? Creation of living things in the water and creation of living things on the air, the fish and the birds, right? But what is a common factor, the background where those living creatures are placed by God? Of course, the fish are placed in the water, right? And the birds are placed in the sky, the air, which is also a fluid. Again, in a pre-scientific society, they didn't know it, that it was a fluid, just as water is a fluid, a thinner fluid, less dense than water, but a fluid nonetheless. And so there are parallel creations. In the water, the fish, on the air, the birds, everybody in its own place. There's order. There's the big emphasis on order. But another common factor between these 2 groups of living things is that they are now consumers, right? They're consumers. They don't photosynthesize, and therefore they depend on the producers that were created the previous day, actually 2 days prior. So you follow the order, there's an order. So, I mean, I'm even suggesting that we can intuit the presence of the divine author here, because the human authors didn't really have a clue back then in the pre-scientific world that producers were needed before consumers and so forth. But there it is. Okay? So we can glean the presence of the divine author if we're gentle and cautious and look for that deeper sense. And what I wanted to illustrate here is precisely the fluidity of the creatures that live in the water and in the sky. All right, so here is what is known as a school of fish. It's amazing. I've done some scuba diving, and I've seen some school of fish, much smaller than this for sure, but balls like this. And at a distance, it just looks like a blue ball that's inside the water, immersed there. And when you get closer, it's just a school of fish that are tightly packed, and they all move in unison. And if you move into them, they would just part the school, part the shape, all right, and create 2 separate balls. And then once you go through them, they'll come back into the single ball. It's very interesting, very rare. In fact, you can see a little detail of that. The diver who is evidently at the bottom here, all right, is just standing, literally standing on the floor, the ocean floor, the sandy bottom. But you see the column of air that is rising here? You can see the air rising. And that air is kind of moving that mass of fish out of the way. Okay, they're just moving. They move away from any kind of object, but they stay together as a whole. And there's a lot of fluidity in this school of fish as they're moving around. He's looking at them, they're looking at him, and it's anybody's guess what anybody's thinking here. But there are different kinds of fish also. It's not just a single species, okay? I see some, they look like maybe tuna or jacks or something like that, but then I think this is a filefish over here, or a soapfish, different. This may be, this black one may be a surgeonfish. Different types of fish are involved in this school. So it's not just a single population, it's actually a community, right? So here's this cloud of starlings. I don't know if you've ever seen this, a starling, a cloud of starling. You see it up north sometimes around this time, from fall to winter, with the sky, the background of a gray sky, and you see these dots, these black dots move back and forth. This is actually several clouds that are merging. They're getting fluid into each other. This one, in contrast, typically is a single species, is the old starling that is also around here. But they move back and forth, and this is just graphic evidence that the air, the sky, is also fluid. Otherwise, these guys just couldn't fly through it. All right, but these are analogous. These are analogous clouds of consumers flying through the fluid or swimming through the fluid. Okay, 5th day, forward. Now the 6th day. Even within the 6th day, it's subdivided into 2 parts. Okay, so he's done creating the earth and the domes above and the lights and everything else. He's done creating the producers. He's done creating the consumers in the oceans and in the sky. What is left? The actual dry land. And what are the living creatures on dry land? Tetrapods, the tetrapods, okay? The ones who conquered the dry land. Those were the last in the evolutionary process of conquering land for consumers, the tetrapods. So meet Ichthyostega. Oh, I anticipate a little bit the passage first. Then God said, let the earth bring forth all kinds of living creatures, cattle, creeping things, and wild animals of all kinds. And so it happened. God made all kinds of wild animals, all kinds of cattle, all kinds of creeping things of the earth. God saw how good it was. This is the first part. Hasn't finished yet. There's no 6th day here. You know, the second part is going to be the creation of the human, right? Then God created the human. I'm saving that for the next slide. But here, notice this first part of the 6th day, he's creating the land creatures. And look at what the author, the human author and the divine author, give us as examples for land creatures. Certainly not going to put fish. They're not even going to put birds, okay? What are they putting? Cattle, tetrapod, creeping things. What would be a creeping thing? A snake. In fact, in that region of the Middle East, the aspids, and they had some very venomous snakes in that region, all right? Remember what I told you about the skeleton of a snake? That it is the